Okay, welcome back to the last part of this slide lectures where we are just kind of reviewing various the last works that we're looking at for that were in the review guide for the final exam. So, okay, Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, 1830. First of all, once again, it's an oil painting. First of all, second of all, it's an example of romantic painting. We talked about Delacroix in the last lecture when talking about Romanticism. Talked about Delacroix and the rivalry between Delacroix and Ingres, and Delacroix representing this French version, French ideal of Romanticism, where it's not just an interest in romantic topics, but also painting in a very kind of virtuosic and gestural way, where it's also using a lot of really embracing the idea of ambient color. Um, so there's all of that. We also had talked, even before we'd ever learned about Romanticism, we talked about this painting in terms of composition, in terms of implied lines, and the big giant implied triangle, comparing that to the double implied triangles of Géricault's Raft of Medusa. And so that would be another thing that you could talk about. And also, we talked about this painting when we talked about the relationship between art and power, and we talked about the idea of art being political, and could art be a form of protest, or take a position sort of anti-establishment. And so this painting is both in some ways a representation of, sort of a street riot, but it should also be seen as a symbolic picture. Obviously, this woman here, the symbolic representation of liberty, she's not based on any actual person, um, and but instead representing sort of, the idealism of France and France's belief in liberty and equality. Um, anyway, is there anything else that I should mention about this work? I think that's pretty good. Okay. Um, David, and we talked about David in the lecture before Romanticism when we talked about the transition out of the Baroque into the Rococo and then later into Neoclassicism. And David is sort of the the epitome of French neoclassicism, really of neoclassicism in general. And we talked about both this painting and also the Death of Marat, kind of compared early David versus slightly later David. And the main thing that I would, let's see, so some of the things that you could take from all of that would be: number one, this is an example of oil painting. Number two, it is French neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is a period that came after the Rococo. Also, this is a political work, although its meaning is kind of somewhat obscure, in that it's a story from the Roman Republic, kind of a legend of the early, the transition from the Republic to the Empire. And, and these three sons are taking an oath to their father, the oath of the Horatii. What else did I want to say? If there's, and the other thing that I mentioned when I did the lecture on neoclassicism is that uh, this is not simply just a return to the style of Poussin. What David was doing is um, much more austere and simplified. It is, although it has some of the same values, it's also slightly different. Um, and okay, yeah, that's pretty good. All right, I think this is the second to last image, maybe. Robert Campin, the Merode Altarpiece, and it is a gorgeous piece. And we talked about this one primarily when we were that same lecture where we were talking about Jan van Eyck, and we were talking about the development of oil painting out of the tradition and the technology of tempera painting. Well, this is an example of a tempera painting that is oil modified, right? It's a so kind of like a transition sort of piece where we start to see the the desire for soft modulations that we later see in Van Eyck's work. We're already seeing them here in Campin's piece, And but this is a panel painting that is definitely, you know, um, a tempera painting, but it is completed with layers of oil varnish, um, and it's also just a pretty amazing piece. All right, and I do believe this is the last image of the set. We'll double check to make sure that's true. Um, so the Vietnam Veteran Memorial, and I, well, we talked about this a lot, and I love this piece. We primarily talked about it when we had that unit on the memorial impulse and the idea of um, art trying to be about remembering something. And I also talked about it a number of other times. I talked about it in terms of the idea of representation. Um, that sometimes representation um, is a much more subtle concept than we might think. That I made the argument that this is one of the greatest representations, definitely as a representation of an event, and in the way that as you walk through it, you see the death toll of the war increasing. Uh, it is it is a very real and a very emotional representation of a tragic event, as a wound in the earth. And so, what would you classify it as? A that's a good question. Is it sculpture? Is it installation? Um, she was an architect, actually. She studied architecture. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but it is one of my favorite pieces. One of the pieces I'm really always glad to talk about. And all right, I think that's the end. Yep, that's it. Okay, good luck tomorrow.